When I was a boy, before the civil wars. No, that's John Aubrey, that's not me. When I was a boy and went to King Edward's Grammar School, Starbridge, at the age of 11, one thing that I was introduced to was the school magazine. And I mean introduced in the sense that we didn't have one at primary school. And the magazine was called the Starbridge Edwardian, and it looked like this. And this is actually the first one that I had, which is November 1954. And it's quite unusual, this one, because it has some photographs in the middle, which was very rare. Normally it was just plain pages like that. And earlier in that year, they had equipped and opened the new school library, so it was a great celebration. It was established in what had been the old assembly hall, but they fitted it all out to be a library. Very good place. I spent a lot of time in there over my school years. But anyway, the magazine. It was issued twice a year in November and May, and there was an editorial group of 4 or 5 boys. Some of them were called editors, some were called assistant editors in varying proportions, and clearly they would be fairly senior pupils, as you would need to have some experience of the school and some academic capability to fill those roles. And so the group changed every year as some boys left and others were brought in, more senior boys. And speaking of senior boys, I remember how awe-inspiring some of them were. Aloof patrician figures, often seeming more remote and unreachable than the members of staff. And they were all of 17 years old. Anyway, the magazine. It had all sorts of aspects of the life of the school in it, with contributions from both boys and from staff, and sometimes from outsiders who would these would be folks that they brought into the school for special events, to open things or present things or to make speeches or whatever. And Starbridge Edwardian, it had all news of the school in, academic and sporting events and achievements, school trips, news of the combined cadet force, reports of the activities of the many school societies, the annual Charter Day celebrations, the headmaster's annual report, reports from each school house, of which there were 6, Brierley, King's, School, Swinford, Quarry and Wollaston. They were all sort of named for the areas surrounding Starbridge or in Starbridge. Also exam results, internal and external, information from recent old boys describing life at university, births, marriages and deaths relating to people connected with the school, and so on. Much more, a lot more, all sorts of stuff. And you could be sure of one thing at least, which was that your name would be in the first edition that you received, the November edition, even if you didn't have all that many subsequent appearances in the magazine, because there was a section marked Salvete, Salvete, which is plural imperative of salveo for greetings, hail, welcome, etc. And salvete is how we were taught to say it when we started to learn Latin. And Frankie Howard clearly went to a different school, as he pronounced it salute in Upper Pompey. And indeed he did go to a different school. He went to Shooters Hill Grammar School in the Royal Borough of Greenwich. But I digress again. The Salvete section listed the year's intake of new boys into the three first forms, 1A, 1B and 1C. And one of the quirks of the school, of which there were many, was that the academic order of the intake forms, high to low, was 1C, 1A and 1B. So the really academic people, the ones who were thought to be the academic cream, they went into 1C. Goodness knows why. Also in the magazine, analogous to Salvete, was the Valete section, Valete, Valete being farewell in Latin. And of course this was a much larger section, as it listed for each departing boy his all the information about him, his achievements, etc. over his life in the school. Normally you would not see that section. I mean, I never saw that section for me, because it would be in the Stourbridge Edwardian that was issued after I'd left, and the same for everybody. So usually you would not see that sort of very significant entry about you in the magazine. Anyway, also in the magazine usually there was another section which was poetry, where any boy who was so inclined could submit a poem. They were varying quality, some light, some heavy, some good, some not so good, and they were all fairly short because of the space available. I expect you wouldn't get far if you submitted something like the Idylls of the King or Paradise Lost. I didn't ever submit any poem myself for publication, and I was never involved in the editing of the magazine, so I don't know if there was a selection process for the poems, or if they just printed everything they got. I don't know. Anyway, in this edition for November '54, which was the first one I got, there was one poem in it which I thought was rather good, and it was submitted by a boy in Form 6S2, which was the second year sixth form for science, and it went like this. Hear the tale of Frederick Worms, whose parents weren't on speaking terms. So when he wrote to Santa Claus, he wrote in duplicate, because one went to Dad, one went to Mum, each asking for plutonium. So Frederick's dad and Frederick's mother, without consulting one another, each bought a lump of largest size, intending it as a surprise. The lumps met in his stocking and laid waste some 10 square miles of land. And alongside where it says lumps of largest size, there's an asterisk, and underneath there's a footnote. It says, i.e. just below the critical mass. Okay, as I say, I thought that was pretty good. And anyway, about 20 years later, I bought a book, and it was this book, and it's called, as you see, A Random Walk in Science, an anthology compiled by R.L. Weber and edited by E. Mendoza. And it's a collection of all sorts of things: articles, stories, anecdotes, poems, and so on. Informative and usually humorous, very enjoyable book. And on page 28 is a poem whose author is identified only by initials, HMK, and which it says was printed in the New Statesman on January the 14th, 1950. And it goes as follows. This is the tale of Frederick Worms, whose parents weren't on speaking terms. So when Fred wrote to Santa Claus, it was in duplicate, because one went to Dad, one went to Mom, and both asked for some plutonium. See the result. Father and mother, without consulting one another, purchased 2 lumps of largish size, intending them as a surprise, which met in Frederick's stocking and laid level 10 square miles of land. Moral: learn from this dismal tale of fission not to mix science with superstition. No, they are not quite the same, but the 1954 one in the Stourbridge Edwardian is clearly a tweaked version of the 1950 one, and the initials of the 1954 claimant in the school magazine were not HMK. I will not say what they were, but they were not HMK. So he wasn't tweaking his own work, which, if he had been tweaking it, he would have written when he was 11 years old. So there we are, a curious example of plagiarism in the school magazine. I should add, by the way, that if you do try that plutonium stuff at home, it won't work. You can't actually produce a self-sustaining chain reaction by sticking 2 subcritical lumps of plutonium into a sock. Otherwise everybody would be doing it. It's a lot more complicated than that, we should be pleased to know. Okay, the end.